Welcome to Two Dumb White Guys. My name is Paul Davidson.
And my name is Scott Norman.
And today we will be performing my final for LCT 8914, Culturally Responsive Pedagogy.
Does that mean you're going to be like acting it out?
I guess we are. So Dr. Aaron and the rest of my classmates, welcome to our Dog and Pony Show of a podcast. For this final, we have been asked to put culturally responsive pedagogy into action by engaging others in enacting culturally responsive pedagogy in schools. So I figured what better way to do that than with my colleague, Mr. Norman, and the podcast and create a podcast episode that is listened to by our other colleagues, students, and parents of Portageville High School.
Welcome.
Welcome, everybody.
Everybody.
Now, we have to support this plan with an independent book that I have been reading throughout the summer, and I chose Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race by Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum. I chose this book because we have actually had a conversation about this particular question in my class before, and it was the only option available on Audible, so I was able to listen to it on repeat in a tractor as I drove circles and circles and circles in a field. Now, Mr. Norman is here for me to bounce these ideas off of and make sure I answer the 5 questions that Dr. Arndt has asked for us to do. So, Mr. Norman, what are those 5 questions?
The 5 questions are, what do you feel is the most salient point this book is trying to make? In what way does the text, or this text, fit into your discussion of culturally responsive pedagogy? What have you learned from this text that might influence your future curricular and instructional practice? Number 4, what connections can you make between the book and some of the authors that we've already, or you guys have already read in this course? And last but not least, what about this book has challenged you, your personal identity, and or your identity as an educator?
All right. Now, this actually harkens back to our very first podcast, the one I did over Dr. April Baker Bell, and we're actually going to talk a little bit about more in depth about racial identity development. And if you want to see a very more nervous approach to this, talking about race and accepting one's own whiteness and all that fun stuff, you could listen to our first podcast where we wrestle with that.
That was literally our first podcast, so it was chaos. We tried to record it 3 times. It was have fun. Yeah.
But now this podcast, we are a little bit more experienced in having these conversations.
He's got a swagger.
Yes, and so we can actually have this conversation a little bit more effectively.
No one on the corner's got swagger like us. Anyway.
This book covers a lot of stuff and is a treasure trove of culturally responsive pedagogy, but for time constraints, I'm only going to focus on the stuff that would be most impactful for Portageville High School, and this will be the stuff around racial identity development. More or less just identity development, but this book does focus heavily on racial identity development.
Okay.
So before we get to that, I have to do what Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum does in part 1 of the book and define terms, specifically one term.
Racial identity development?
No.
Okay, well, I'll ask that one next.
So, I actually have a question for you. Mr. Norman, define racism.
Racial prejudice in action.
Okay, that is a definition of racism. Now, you have to keep in mind that words can have multiple definitions.
Yes.
And I feel like a lot of the problems that we are having politically right now is a not understanding of each side's term of racism. So whenever we're going to talk about racism in this book, we're going to be talking about
people who hate 5Ks.
No, we're actually going to be talking about this one. This is how Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum defines it. Many people use the term prejudice and racism interchangeably, but they're not. Racism is a system of advantage based on race. Essentially, it is prejudice plus power. So it's not just prejudice, it's the addition of power, and that is what becomes the formula for racism and how they're talking about it in this book, and how one side of the argument is talking about it politically now, and the other side is talking about it politically at the same time.
So not to jump immediately into weeds, but does that mean that if someone doesn't have power, they can't be racist?
Kind of, yes. Because it's all, but same way that women technically can't be sexist. Because
this is a whole can of worms.
Yeah, because you are able to push forward you're able to have certain advantages because of your adherence to the dominant culture. And we're going to get more in depth with that whenever we actually get into the first steps of racial identity development. This actually, back on July 20th, Dr. Arndt shared with us an NPR segment featuring Abram X. Kendi, which he echoes the definition this way. We imagine the term as an identifier, as a fixed sort of category or label, and that's just blatantly not true. Racist is a descriptive term, so it's not a category that you can kind of put somebody in. It's more of just a description you can place on something. So you can't box somebody into a racist box.
Okay, so like calling someone racist is describing one aspect of them, not meaning that they have all the qualifiers of everything else in the box.
Yes.
Okay.
That is what it is. So, now, white people, we're really good at spotting active racism. And that is the very blatant racism that you are used to seeing. But
we can say things about white people and us because our podcast is called Two Dumb White Guys.
Indeed, it is. But we're also looking at that passive racism, and that's where the second half of the definition kind of comes into play. That passive racism, which is described as laughing at when a racist joke is told, letting exclusionary hiring practices go unchallenged, accepting as appropriate the omissions of people of color from curriculum, and avoiding difficult race-related issues. And that's on page 91 of this particular book. Now, one of the goals of CRP is to take down that both passive and active racism. Now, in the book, she uses a conveyor belt example to kind of highlight this, but I'm going to actually use an example of a rowboat.
Okay.
So you have three categories. You have active racism, passive racism, and people that are working against racism. So active racism are the people that are paddling the boat in the racist direction. Passive racism are the people just sitting in the boat not doing anything about it. And then the people who are working against it, which is what culturally responsive pedagogy is wanting us to try to do, are the people that are paddling against the active racism.
Okay.
So by doing nothing, you're just letting the active racism still kind of pull us in a particular direction.
Okay.
All right, so now that we have now that we have established what we mean when we're talking about racism, we can actually move into the racial identity development. So now we focus on racial identity development because that's one of the harder ones to ignore necessarily, because unless you are like Islam or a Muslim and have certain are parts of certain sects of Islam that require you to have certain facial or dress a certain way, you're not going to necessarily know what somebody's religion is. But that is also something that helps go towards identity. In fact, it is, if I could find it on this page, I'm accidentally opened the wrong page. There we go. So whenever we create an identity, we're talking about like dimensions of ourselves. So your gender, so male, female, young, old, wealthy, middle class, poor, gay, lesbian, heterosexual, able-bodied, disabled, Christian, Muslim, atheist, Jewish, or Buddhist, or Hindu. So those are all the different things that we use to create our own identity.
Okay.
And as mentioned, outside of the gender-based one, the only ones that are really that you really cannot avoid and you naturally are going to be seeing is the ones that are based on race.
Okay, because you're literally wearing it.
Yeah, you're literally wearing it. And so that's what we're going to be kind of looking at. And so we'll start off with the early years. Okay. So as you have just recently had a son.
He's wandering in and out of the room.
Yes, he's wandering in and out of the room as we record this. So in the early years, a lot of people think that children are completely blind to race, but they're not. They actually are, and they will actually ask certain questions as they notice the world around them and things that are different from them, and they'll be trying to figure out how that works. And during that particular time, that's when they learn that talking about race is not something that is a quote-unquote unpolite thing to do. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of the reason why we begin to see this type of... And that's part of the reason why we begin to see this. Where am I going with this? You don't know where I'm going with this.
I don't. I'm sitting in the boat. I'm passively listening to the.
Basically, that's where they learn that it's not polite to talk about race, and so that's why race all of a sudden becomes this taboo issue that people are unwilling to speak of.
Because a little kid walks up and goes in the middle of the store, "Hey, Mom, why is he chocolate?"
Oh, yeah, that's actually an example that Dr. Tatum uses in her book, is that they'll say something like that, or they'll see like a biracial parent and child and be like, "Mommy, why don't they match?" And so most of the time parents will be like, "Shh, Don't talk about that.
Yeah.
And that's where they learn this conditioning that, no, that's not a thing to talk about. Whenever we actually do need to talk about it. And she kind of talks about by not, she expresses that we shouldn't necessarily say, no, let's not talk about that. Actually take your time and explain it, which it might be an uncomfortable conversation. But in order for us to actually learn, we have to have some of these uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
So that's the early years. And I could go a little bit more in depth with early years, but since we teach adolescence, I figured that would probably be the bigger time to kind of talk about. And that is actually whenever you really see people's identities starting to emerge.
Yeah.
That's whenever people really start to be very concerned about what their identity is.
Yeah.
And so that is what we're going to be kind of tackling with the identity development in adolescence. So, and this is actually where we get the answer to the question, why do all the black kids sit together in the cafeteria? The reason why... Spoiler alert, spoilers for the title of the book. The reason why is that they're looking for someone to share an experience in. So the example they kind of get that Dr. Tatum gives is that throughout the day they are constantly being these black kids are constantly being confronted with different racial stereotypes that are being harped upon them because of their ethnicity. And so they get kind of tired of it. It could be something from a teacher saying, why aren't you going to the dance? Oh, I don't feel like it. And they say, we know all of you love dancing. That's something that is kind of racist. That is something that's very racist. And
Now, wait a minute. Is it racist if it's not a teacher saying it because they don't have power?
Yes.
Okay, because that's where I'm going to...
Well, keep in mind, and also keep in mind, traditionally, what is the traditional dominant culture makeup of a teacher? What is the stereotypical teacher?
Actually, stereotypical teacher, I guess, would be a white woman.
A white woman, yes.
Yeah.
A white woman who's usually middle class.
Yeah.
And so it's that. So if you're not fitting into that particular worldview, you're going to get those particular types of questions, which I know women aren't necessarily a dominant culture gender-wise, but they do still have that dominant culture of fact that they are white, probably heterosexual, and probably Christian. And so that is where they get the power from, and that's where but
around here, not in my high school back in Virginia, but
anyway. So where was I going with this? So anyway, the teacher says that particular comment to him, or a white classmate of theirs says, "Oh, I love your hair. Can I touch your hair?" That type of thing, and they just get tired of being inundated with these dumb, stereotypical white people questions, and they want somebody to commemorate with who can understand them. Their white friends aren't going to understand them, but who will understand them? The girls at the black table or the people at the black table. And so that's why you begin to see in middle school primarily these students begin to kind of section off in different areas.
So at this point, we're kind of like walking through the book. We've seen what identity development is. We've seen why they're beginning, like why, and when I say they here, I mean kids, not any specific race of kids, but why kids are beginning to differentiate themselves based on race, especially in adolescence. And
this actually comes into, well, finish your question.
I was just going to say, like, what is where does the book go with that, I guess is my question.
So in adolescence, they start to kind of come into one another, and they kind of lean on one another in order to do this. Now, the problem is that because they are being inundated with the white dominant culture, they start to pivot towards certain stereotypes and certain negative stereotypes. And this is where we kind of get into, if I can find it here on my list over here, I think it is we read it the other day. It's the one about not learning. I got to figure out which group we said. But she talks about this thing called not learning. And so essentially what happens is they start to really double down on their racial differences. And so they start trying to act black, or they start trying to act their particular ethnicity. Oh, I'm expected to act Y. So the very big problematic part of that is that because of that, they start to think that, because I'm X ethnicity, I'm not supposed to do well at school, and so they stop trying in school. Or because I'm expected to do this, I might as well do this. And so they don't necessarily have these particular viewpoints in looking into how to develop their race, or how to develop their identity racially.
That was our guest speaker, Elias.
So they will begin to choose this term that is called not learning. Basically saying, I refuse to learn from you because you are not like me, kind of.
Oh, I gotcha. So just rejecting people who are not of their particular racial category.
Because and it's not because of anything you or me or that particular teacher had done. It's really probably more of what they had experienced in the past. Mm-hmm. They keep on getting these teachers that kind of devalue their ethnic and cultural diversity because it is different from the mainstream dominant culture. And so they choose to be like, if I'm not going to be appreciated, then I'm just going to not learn from you. Mm-hmm. And that's the big problem that we encounter at this particular point in time. And this kind of does pivot into our the next chapter, which talks about racial identity in adulthood, because you begin to really see people actually flourish and be able to latch on to their own racial identity, and it's usually whenever they go off into college, where they actually get to see that there's more successful black people than Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. Uh-huh. They begin to actually see and get to study those other cultures.
Was Malcolm X a successful person?
He was very successful.
And there's a whole interesting conversation to be had there about his initial goals versus his achieved goals. And
that is true.
The fact that once he actually started trying to work towards specific goals, then the people around him killed him.
But the point is that African American students or black kids,
those are the two they hear about.
Yeah, those are the only two people.
Jackie Robinson.
And Jackie, they only hear about, or Rosa Parks, they only hear about 4 particular black people in their entire learning of school. And so they think that because of that school is not necessarily a thing that they are expected to be able to do, because the school does not reflect their cultural values. Yeah, Mr. Norman just spilt water all over himself.
I'm sorry.
It is hilarious.
I'm not used to drinking out of not my bottle.
That came off wrong considering your infant son is right there. All right, so...
milk.
So once people go off to college, they're exposed to these particular courses. So one of the things that Dr. Tatum actually talks about that you could possibly go with is actually start, instead of having them have to wait to be able to explore these African American cultures classes or these Latin American cultures classes, you could actually have them focus more, try to have them probably like project-based learning in which they are allowed to particularly look into this, or since we are experts in learning ourselves, we just take the extra step and actually learn about these particular things and embed them into our classes, which I understand for the science and the math classes, people that teach those particular classes, it's a little bit harder, but for me and you who are in the humanities, that is something that we could easily do. Yeah. I could feature more African American authors. You could focus on more African American histories outside of there was slavery and then there was civil rights. I'm not saying that that's all you focus on. Yeah. I've never actually sat in your class. But that is just an example, because I'm thinking of the stereotypical way that people usually look at English and history. And this then pivots into the more interesting thing that we're kind of battling with ourselves.
Yeah.
Understanding whiteness in a white context. And that's kind of the next step of the book. Because here's the thing. People, whenever they're a part of the dominant culture, do not realize that they are on that side of the fence. And so one of the examples she gives is Dr. Tatum runs these workshops with teachers. And she asks them this question, describe the question, how would you describe yourself ethnically and social, or not socially, but economically. And for the most part, the teachers of color will say, I am black and I am middle class, or I am Latinx and middle class. But whenever it's a white teacher, they will not say that they are white. They will just say, in fact, she gives the example of one woman saying, I'm middle class and I guess I'm just normal. Which she's not. She has a white ethnicity. And so traditionally people kind of just focus on, if they are part of that dominant culture, they're not going to say it. So this even goes as far as to say, like, whenever she does this activity, if she has someone who is homosexual, they'll say that they are homosexual or gay, where none of the participants that are heterosexual will say, I'm a heterosexual, blah, 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 blah. Women will point out that they are a woman. Men will not say that they are men. Because they expect that.
And that's the problem with our society. No, I'm kidding. That's just.
But that's kind of what they're talking about, and that is actually a big issue. Is that we have people that do not understand that they are white, and once you actually can wrap your head around your whiteness,
I'm actually kind of pinkish.
Well, and she also talks about that in the earlier chapter, which talks about the early years in chapter 3. She mentions that, and like her son's like, he's like, but white people are white, and she's like, no, and she points out a white lady, and she's like, does she look like this piece of paper? And he's like, oh no, and so yeah, they actually do have that conversation in it. Where was I before we got off on that?
We were discussing the fact that white people don't identify as white men.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so if you can't identify that you're a white, you cannot understand.
A white.
Yeah. Well, come on. We're two dumb white guys.
Yeah.
We've already started accepting our whiteness.
We are both a white.
We've started accepting our whiteness. But if you can't get your head around that, then you really can't see the advantages that you're getting for being a part of the dominant culture. Mm-hmm. And she even goes further into this, like certain women who are. She interviewed some poor white women and asked that ended up getting like certain successes and like came out of the problematic situation they were in. Mm-hmm. And she would and the entire time they would admit that they were white, they would admit they were poor, and they would talk about the hard work that they had done, mm-hmm. but they would never talk about like certain advantages they received because of their whiteness, mm-hmm. because they might get a lucky break at getting in a particular apartment or they were allowed to get a particular job. But if they were African American or if they were Latin American, would they have possibly gotten that apartment? Possibly not, because of the racial difference. Mm-hmm. Would they have gotten that job?
Like the studies where the same person
and she actually
submits the same resume,
and she actually quotes those studies later on in the book about how we have this kind of disruption or this gap here of people that. If you are quote unquote white, why do you even do quote unquote? But if you are white, you get those advantages. Where if you're not going to get those advantages. And so that's kind of what so that's where we start off with understanding whiteness in a white context. And here's the other big thing: once white people figure out they're white, it's a hard time for them. And it really is. They struggle with it. They struggle to wrap their head around their whiteness. Because in their
I was to say, explain. What do you mean?
They're not used to They're not used to being considered just a race. They're used to thinking of themselves as individuals instead of a group of people.
So now, in context here, we are talking about America, the United States of America.
Yes. Or United States of America.
Because I was going to say there are a lot of places around the world where. That it's the reverse.
Yeah.
You know, if you go to India,
then all of a sudden you become really aware of your whiteness.
Yeah.
But you got to keep in mind that but because of this thing that she talks about in the prologue about us kind of de factoing, segregating ourselves, and kind of how white people kind of isolate themselves, they do not participate in as ethnically diverse communities. Once they become woken to their whiteness, they can't handle it. They don't know what to think.
# stay woke.
And they can't wrap their head around being white. In fact, in the conversations with people who are of other ethnicities, they find it intimidating that these people can talk so openly about race and their own racial experiences, but they feel so insecure about it. It's because they're white and they're not used to having to talk about that.
I see. So it's just basically because it's not necessarily that they're insecure in the sense that like, oh no, I'm white, I'm terrified about being white.
Well, some people are.
It's that they're just genuinely like, they're not used to having discussions about race.
They're not used to having discussions about race. And what you were saying, the white guilt thing does apply. Because then they start to see all these advantages and horrible things that have happened to people who are not white, but they have been able to avoid them because of their whiteness. That white guilt starts to set in.
I see. Once again, this is important in the context of especially the West.
Oh yeah, which around here, I do feel like we do have people around here that are in their white bubble, per se. But for the most part, we do have like a nice blending of ethnicities.
Yeah, I would especially say in the districts that we are in, there is a much more significant blend with less problem than other districts that I have been part of.
Yes.
And I think that. You know, you see that reflected because we do have a whole bunch of students who are mixed and who crack jokes about that all the time.
And we're going to talk about that. That's another thing I loved about this book is they actually went super in depth with mixed individuals who are biracial. But where was I going? I interrupted you while you were talking.
That's okay.
How we don't we do, and I'm not saying that race isn't necessarily an issue in this district. Is it something that we could possibly become better at? Yes. Is it the biggest problem that we are facing? No.
Yeah.
We have other problems that are more pressing, which is part of the reason why, which also kind of feeds into the thing that we're trying to do, which I feel like our problem is more of a socioeconomic one, which that might be a white thing to say, but we do see a lot of those more problems between the haves and the have-nots than an individual who is African American and an individual who is white.
Yeah, and I do think that is very much true. Like I said, within this district in particular, you see the divisions and the struggles are very much divided socioeconomically.
And not to say, and I've not taught in these particular districts, but if we were to go maybe 15 minutes south of here, in that particular district, which will remain, or those particular districts that will remain nameless,
No,
we're
I'm
30
kidding.
minutes from Arkansas. In those districts that will remain nameless, I do feel like those racial problems are a much more poignant thing. Now, this isn't to say we shouldn't talk about race in our school.
And that also goes back to just for any of you who are way outside, you have no idea where we are. Just the idea is also we are in southeast Missouri, and there's a whole lot of other background factors that go in.
We are in the third poorest county in the state, and
Yeah.
the two counties south of us are number 1 and number 2.
And Portageville is in an area where, thankfully, we didn't have the polarization into the white town and the black town, which has happened in a lot of counties around here, and it just hasn't really happened as much here. So there's a better blend than there are in several counties around. But anyway, so there's a whole bunch of other background information that you need to know. But not for this, because we're talking about the book, not our county.
Yes.
So continue.
Well, we need to connect the book to our county, though, our own particular situation. So, since when white people figure out that they're white, can be some fragility about it, and so you kind of have to. You need to keep encouraging them to accept their whiteness, and not necessarily a nationalist type of perspective, but kind of a more, I'm white.
Okay, so just to clarify, he said not necessarily. Not necessarily.
In fact, it actually talks about the reason why you see that type of white pride emerge is because most of the time, when someone goes that particular route, it is because what is their socioeconomic level?
Usually low.
They are from a lower socioeconomic level. The part of the reason why you see that, especially nowadays, and we see kind of this uptick in this type of hateful rhetoric in society, is because the people from the lower class that are white see people who are ethnically different than them, who are black, Hispanic, or Asian, who are doing better than them, and they automatically think, how did they get better than me? This is the land of opportunities. This is the American dream. Why am I not where they're at, even though I have all these advantages? Even though I have the advantage of being white, why are they doing more successful than me? Which that's not how the world works. We can understand that, but that is the part of the reason why you see people who are of lower class white begin to pivot into that more hateful grasp of being white.
And there's not to get too distracted, but Joyner Lucas's "I'm Not Racist" is a really interesting perspective on some of that. Like it's a song-ish, it's a discussion, and it is incredibly profane. So I'm not if you're one of our younger listeners, I'm not recommending you jump in and go listen to Joyner Lucas's song. But it is a perspective of a lower income white person and a lower income black person having a conversation about why they're both not racist, and then all the things that they say that are racist. And how they come to anyway.
All right.
It's worth checking out.
But then we move on to the beyond black and white, which we're not going to necessarily go super in depth. We actually have 2 students that fit these particular categories, and I'm not going to necessarily go super in depth because I do not want to categorize or stereotype those particular students. But if we ever see an increase of either any of these populations, Latinx, Native, Asian, Pacific Islander, Middle Eastern, North African identity, I will probably dive into this book again and look in more in depth. I will mention one thing with Latinx, and it kind of pivots into something we read in class. I believe it was the silence dialogue and the undoing appropriates taking down SAE, and it talks about ELLs, which
English language learners.
Language learners. And if we ever see an uptick in that, which just about 20 minutes south of us, we have a large immigrant Hispanic population. And if we were to ever see that population drift north, one thing that we need to keep in mind if we do see an increase in ELL students is not to shame their native language. And because a lot of people view that type of being a bilingual, being someone that does not speak English natively as a disadvantage. But in reality, it is an advantage because they know 2 languages.
Yeah, and that's actually something that we have I know I talk about it in my class all the time, that I was told that when I lived in Germany for a while, and when I was there, I was told a joke by a German guy who just thought he was hilarious, and he said, "What do you call somebody who can speak 3 languages?"
What do you call somebody who can speak 3 languages?
Trilingual. What do you call someone who can speak 2 languages?
Bilingual.
What do you call someone who can speak 1?
Monolingual.
American. And so, the idea is that we are the only country that is yeah, you speak. It's not entirely true because the French are kind of protective about their language. The reason France and America don't get along is because we just are the same thing in different sizes. But anyway, point being that if it is viewed as a negative thing to be able to speak multiple languages, it is only a local to America thing, or local to areas that have not had an extensive interaction with other countries, because most countries you travel an hour and you're in somewhere else that speaks a different language, so you have to be able to learn more than one. But anyway.
And one of the things that both this book and those articles talk about is that, and it's something that both me and you can latch onto, and most other teachers can latch onto, is that at the end of the day, what are we really concerned with? We want our kids to think. We want our kids to be able to learn and have that higher level thought processes. Who cares what language they're doing that higher level thinking in?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
As long as they can produce a thought-provoking answer, that's what matters. Now, at the end of the day, if we're going to, the example I give is, am I going to force a bilingual student to do pre-writing or smaller level assessments that aren't necessarily super important in English? Now, I could probably let some of that slide. But do I need to, if we have a formative final assessment, does it have to be in English? Yes, but we can work with them and help with them with their English on that. But as long as they have the thinking done first, that's all that should matter. All right. Then we move into what I've found probably one of the most beneficial things in this particular novel, this book. As you pointed out, we have a very large biracial community here in this town. And the chapter 9 of this book is talking about biracial mixed families. And the interesting thing about that, which, of course, saying this out loud seems silly, but because it's not necessarily said out loud that often, I feel it's beneficial to say it. That we've had biracial individuals throughout all of history.
Yeah.
But they've only become a common thing within the past 20 years because of the U.S. Census Bureau. Up until 20 years ago, you could only mark one particular category, and if you had any non-white ethnicity in you, you automatically had to mark that other ethnicity. And so because of that change, we are seeing a boom and a increase of people who are biracial. And as a result, traditionally, people who were biracial were automatically labeled as African American or black, and so they would focus more, they would embrace their black identity more than their white identity.
And to clarify, he's not saying that there are literally more biracial people. He's saying there are more people who consider themselves biracial.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because before then, people were kind of forced to identify with their non-white ethnicity, and so biracial. So being biracial is not a new thing, but the concept of it for adolescents, particular, is starting to be kind of a new thing within schools. And so you're seeing the option for these biracial individuals that they don't have to be black. They can be this new middle ground biracial thing, and that is actually probably more beneficial for them because they have the ability, because it's very similar to the bilingual thing. If you are biracial, you probably have learned the skills to be able to participate in the white world and the black world. And so you should take advantage of that and be able to use that. In fact, they give us a ton of examples in this book of individuals that decide to go about that way. And so that is one of the more interesting things that I found in it. It wasn't necessarily the most developed portion of this book, but it did talk about it, and she did kind of hammer home and bring up, like, you know what, have these kids embrace their biracialism. Instead of forcing them into one direction or the other, let them embrace being biracial. And that brings us to the final step, the breaking the silence. What should we do? What should Porterville High School do to help solve this problem? And that's what she kind of talks about in this last part of the book, what to do to solve the problem. And so the easy answer to that is actually just start talking about race. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Actually participate in the conversation. If a student start talking about it, don't try to change the subject and don't try to shut it down.
Yeah, we don't in my classroom.
Yeah, and that's a beneficial thing. Like, we should have these conversations, because we cannot become a better society if we stay silent and ignorant about these particular issues. And so by having these conversations, being actually open about these conversations, that should help a long way. And for our colleagues, one of the things I would say is just keep in mind this, what happens whenever, keep in mind that adolescence is a very complex time in any particular individual's life, especially if you are a member of a non-dominant cultural community, and all because someone...
Like Cubs fans. Sorry, continue.
And all because you're not a part, all because a student is not a part of what you deem culturally appropriate, that does not mean that you should belittle what they believe and what they see. Because at the end of the day, who cares if they agree with you culturally? We just want them to help make our society overall a better place. And so we need to get them to think. We need to get them to learn. And if you decide to try to force them into a box, they're not going to want to learn. And so you need to be at least capable of not forcing them into that box in order to have that open line of communication.
So, you've covered a lot of different things. You've talked about a lot of different things. Which of these various points do you think is like the most significant point that Miss Beverly Daniel Tatum, PhD, is trying to make?
Identity development. Racial identity development, how we develop our identities throughout, and it's not just at adolescence. Adolescence is just where we become aware of it. We develop our identity throughout all of our lives. In fact, me and you right now are currently developing our identities, both racially and through a enormous amount of different possible concepts. We're developing those identities. And so we're a work in process. We're always trying to figure it out. So identity development is the biggest thing to walk away with, and just to understand that not everybody's identity is the same, and to not belittle people of the non-dominant culture. Okay.
And so you talked a little bit about teaching, about how we need to be talking more about race in our classrooms. I'm also doing master's classes, and we just had a conversation about culturally responsive pedagogy. I don't know in your class what you've been talking about, but how does this book play into the idea of culturally responsive pedagogy?
Well, it talks about basically everything that we've talked about in this particular class. It talks about the social politics of schooling, and how schooling is set up in a way that benefits the people that adhere to the dominant culture, the white, male, middle class, Christian, heterosexual culture, and how school is designed in a way that will benefit those people, and how we need to not necessarily focus on that particular group, but be more opening and not necessarily keep on teaching the same things that are going towards that. It talks about disrupting institutional norms, us having this conversation, us releasing this episode of this podcast, not just stopping and not just doing that, but as we continue to go into this next school year, us continuing to have these types of conversations, not only between us, but with our students and with our colleagues. That is important for it. Critical pedagogy. She does talk a lot about critical pedagogy, and I did not go as in depth with that. Just being critical of what is being taught. Looking, and we kind of talked about this in the first episode with Dr. April Baker Bell, where we talked a little bit about To Kill a Mockingbird and whether or not we should teach it, that type of thing.
Oh, yeah, what does it actually say?
Yeah. So being critical about the pedagogy, for your example, as you're teaching a war, look at it from different perspectives. Being critical of, all right, this is the traditional narrative of the story. Who's not being mentioned? Who's not being talked about in this?
We actually do that quite a bit. I like looking at, the Spanish-American War, where we kind of made up an excuse and attacked someone. But, there's a bunch of different things where you can look at.
Oh, by the way, I Won't Learn For You was Cole. That was a Cole article. What she talks about with the I Don't Learn For You, that's another big thing to talk about, how students are not willing to learn if you're not willing to accept them, who they are, and or acknowledge their culture or their heritage. She talks about SAE. This talks about SAE and how you don't necessarily have to use standard English at all particular points in time. Funds of knowledge. She doesn't talk about funds of knowledge as much, but tapping into that's type of things that you can, and just being an advocate for CRP, Culturally Responsive Pedagogy.
So, what are you actually changing in your future curriculum and instructional practice based on what you learned?
Based on what I've learned, I am going to move more toward, last year I kind of already started
the phrase
this.
Dang white people more. No, I'm kidding. It's a joke.
Last year I actually kind of started doing this, but focus more on project-based learning, where I give students more an opportunity to kind of have control over what they're reading, what they're learning about. We don't always have to focus on a centralized text. Take control power out of my hands, put it more in their hands, and so they can investigate other cultures or their own culture a little bit more in depth. So that's one of the big ways that I'm going to do it. Even last year, I started my take down of standard English, where we kind of look at both non-standard and standard English and kind of weigh the two varieties and see how non-standard English is perfectly fine and acceptable, and how standard English actually sometimes steals from that. I have a unit in lessons that we kind of focus on that, and just kind of appreciating that aspect of English a little bit more. And yeah, it's mainly those two things. Just willing to have those conversations, not trying to stop those conversations, but allow those conversations to be talked about and to flourish a little bit more.
So I just have to, one thing, you kept saying the acronym, whatever the heck you call it.
SAE.
SAE, that's Standard American English?
Yes.
Okay. I didn't get that until you started saying Standard English.
I realized that after I said SAE. In my notes, I have SAE.
Because I'm thinking I keep thinking UAE, like the United Arab Emirates, and I was really confused. But anyway, so last but not least, you talked a lot about connections between this book and other books. I figure that is well covered there.
Hopefully.
But
fingers crossed.
What about this book challenged your personal identity as an educator?
Well, I feel a lot more we had this conversation about accepting your whiteness, and if you listen to the Dr. April Baker Bell podcast, I was at a very early stage of accepting my whiteness, even though I was aware of it. But I'm much more comfortable to having these talk or discussing about race now, even though the beginning of this podcast, not so much, but we haven't done a podcast in 3 months.
We're shaking the rust off.
We're shaking the rust here.
So don't consider this the launch of next season. This is the scraps of last season.
Yeah, but essentially, I feel more comfortable having these conversations, and I know more about how these systems work. I feel more comfortable with seeing certain students that are having these issues, these personal issues about their identity that this book talks about, and I feel like I could, even though they might not accept my help, I can at least be more understanding towards where they're at in their identity development, and I can bring some more of these ideas within my own teaching. So I personally just feel more comfortable talking about race than I did the first 3 times I read this book.
So if you're somebody who's listened all the way through this podcast, not because you had to grade it, then you probably at some point have, we've stomped on your toes or slapped you in the face or done something, because as we get more comfortable talking about race, we probably also get more awkward talking about race.
Yeah, and people are not as comfortable with that, and that's one of the things she talks about.
So just understand that a lot of the things that we discussed here is relaying to you what the book Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum says. This isn't necessarily us going off about our personal vendettas. This is us explaining what the book, mostly Paul explaining what the book is about. And So if you want to debate that and critique that and whatever, feel free, comment, and tell us how dumb and white we are, which is our name. And then go read the book, and you can actually get the full picture.
Yes,
of
because
what's going on.
There's a lot to this book, and I tried to squeeze as much as I could into this now going about 40-minute podcast.
All right. So is there anything else that we need to know or anything else you need to squeeze in so that you get a good grade on this? Because we're going for A+.
I don't know. I don't think I got it anymore. I think I've covered it. I probably missed out a lot of this, and Miss Beverly Daniel Tatum, or Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, if you are listening to this, I apologize if I butchered it. But as you mentioned in your book, near the very end, a good-hearted attempt to having these conversations is better than not having them at all.
So we're trying. This is only our second big one really on race, unless you count the one about Native Americans-ish. So sadly, those two have probably been two of our least organized overall conversations that we've had. But continue to listen. Hopefully we'll get better.
Hopefully. But until next time, my name's been Paul Davidson.
And Lord willing, my name is and will continue to be... Man, I'm rusty. I am Scott Norman, and Lord willing, it'll stay that way.
And we've been two
dumb white guys.